Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. I'd like to introduce myself and welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on building rapport with youth community leaders. This webinar is one in a series of webinars addressing topics aligned with the School of Professional Studies Masters of Science program in negotiation and conflict resolution. My name is Dominic Rinaldi, and I am a senior admissions counselor in the School of Professional Studies, and I will be hosting today's session. If you are able to hear me well, please type yes in the Q&A box located in the list of controls at the bottom or top of your screen. Great, I'm seeing some yeses roll into the Q&A box. I encourage you to utilize this Q&A box as you develop questions during today's presentation. At the end of today's session, we will be addressing some of these questions you have for our presenters. We will not be using the chat box function for this webinar, so please direct any questions through the Q&A box. I would also like to share with the group today that the session is going to be recorded and will be made available to you after today's session. At this time, I would like to welcome today's presenters. Joining us today is Dr. Beth Fisher-Yoshida, Academic Director for the Master of Science in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program. Along with Dr. Fisher-Yoshida, we have Joan Lopez, who is a Program Manager for the Youth, Peace, and Security program at the Earth Institute's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, or commonly known as AC4. At this time, I'll hand it over to Dr. Beth Fisher-Yoshida. Hello, Beth. How are you today?
Hi, Don. Thank you so much. And hi, Juan.
Hi, Beth, and hi, everyone.
So I'm just going to set the context a little bit, and then Juan is going to present for 25-30 minutes, and then we will have a little discussion and then be really happy to answer your questions. So we have been doing field work in Medellín, Colombia for about 5.5 years now, and we've taken many lessons from both successes and not so much successes in our experience there. And one of the things that we've noticed is that while you need to have a structure in what you're doing and a method and set of processes, you also need to be open to what is emergent and organic. And that is part of being receptive and responsive to the needs of the different stakeholder groups with whom you're working. And so there are many aspects of doing field work that we think are important, and today's topic is one of them, in building rapport with the people with whom you're working, especially if your goal is to make it as participatory as possible, which is our goal. So down the road, we are in the process of authoring a book about our methodology, which we hope will be published before the end of this calendar year. And as part of our process, we've also invited the different people who we work with over the years to co-author the different chapters with us. But I'm going to turn it over to Juan now, and he'll lead you through today's topic about building rapport. Juan?
Thank you, Beth. So let's first go through the agenda, and then I'll go ahead and start going into detail about this methodology that Beth talked about. So we'll have this beginning part that has to do with entering a new system as an outsider. Then we'll speak a little bit about how to enter the system from the viewpoint of complex systems approach. Dealing with messiness and structure would be the third moment of the webinar. And then this method that we have adapted into our work that comes from ethnography, which is participant observation, and then the importance of taking a distance after doing different iterations of fieldwork. Then we'll discuss how is it that you can assess, how is it that you can see whether there is the existence of rapport in your relationships. And then we'll just open it up for questions, for suggestions, critiques, and clarifications. So the first thing that I would like to say is that relationships and rapport are not ends. They are really processes. It isn't that we build a relationship and that it becomes stable and static, but rather relationships are always in a state of flux. They're always having changes, and those they are processes and have to be maintained and nourished and strengthened. So they're not ends. That's very important to understand. Entering a system as an outsider can be a complicated thing. There are histories, especially in places where conflict has been part of the everydayness. There is a distrust of outsiders, and this distrust is justified. So there has to be a delicacy from an outsider when they enter these systems. And one of the ways we have learned to do it is to really value and actually show your ignorance. You do not know the system. You cannot enter it with some preconceived notions, knowledge to make assessments about this system. That can be a city, that can be a neighborhood, that can be a corporation, etc. So there is some value in acknowledging your ignorance about how the system functions and making it very explicit so that you then start a process of learning. In these places, in these systems, histories are complex, right? They sometimes are even contradictory. So one person can tell you about some significant moment in the history of a place that deeply contradicts with what a person, another person tells you about. So it is important to be able to look at these tensions between histories and stories, right? Storytellings, how people tell these stories. And there is a method to be able to elicit these complexities and to be able also to deal with the contradictions within the histories and the way people tell these stories. So our case, it's Medellín in Colombia, a very complex city that engulfs really the dynamics of both conflict and resistance to conflict of the whole country for the past 60 years. It is, as we have mentioned it with Beth at some moments, it is this microcosm for all of these dynamics that have taken place all around the country, given the presence of displaced communities all around the city, representing each part of the country and therefore manifesting the dynamics of conflict and resistance to conflict of the whole country. So relationship building, it isn't this thing that you build with someone or with a group of people. There is also a mediation between this relation that you create with someone or with a group, that it's the environment, right? That's another element of the relationship that has to be accounted for. And to be able to work within the environment, with the environment and with the group of people you work with, then you have to look at the system as a complex system, right? The city, the neighborhood, the corporation, etc., as this complex set of relationships. So first, the history of the place is very important. As I mentioned before, Medellín, especially the outskirts, the outer parts, as you see in this picture, that are mostly these hills that surround the city, have been built starting from the late 50s from displaced communities from around the country, right? Displaced because of the internal warfare between guerrilla groups, paramilitary groups, and the Colombian military. So it is important to understand this in order to start to build your relationship with the people and with the environment. And then history, as we said, is not this linear thing that can be read easily, but you have to engage in a process of listening to the storytelling of what this history means for people. And here we divide the personal and the social narratives of this history, right? And it's here where you start to see the contradictions, the frictions, the way people imagine the history of Medellín in this case to be, right? We, with Beth and with our colleague Aldo, spent a lot of times at the beginning of these almost 6 years of work among youth leaders in Medellín, walking up and down these mountains, listening to the personal, to the social stories about the history of these neighborhoods. And doing this, we also understood the geography of the city. Why is it that in certain places, the violence becomes more, expresses itself more, and in other places it doesn't? And things, for example, as gateways from the city into the ocean are important in this sense, right? Because these are places that are always in a state of negotiation, struggle between different actors, from criminal actors to political actors, such as guerrillas, paramilitaries, and also the government. Then in listening to this, you also start to capture the culture of the city, the culture also of the neighborhoods, which is important. And through that, you start to also understand the politics around it. And in dealing with politics, it is important to identify what are the existing networks of people. So for example, in the case of youth community leaders in Medellín, there are existing networks of cooperation that began when processes of resistance to the violence began. So there are historical networks, historical processes of cooperation that exist already in the system, and that as an outsider, as a person that goes into this place, you need to be able to understand, to then enter, quote unquote, these networks, right? Because there is knowledge in these networks, there are practices in these networks, there are technologies in these networks that allow you to then further your relationship building with the people with whom you're working. And all of this, as I said before, has to do both with the person with whom you're building this relationship, but also with the environment, right, where this relationship is taking place. So there is almost a triangle between the actual people or group of people, yourself as this outsider, for the lack of a better word, and then the environment. And this leads us to understanding the other, the person and the environment that you are going to enter and start to build your relationship with. So to understand the other with a capital O means to understand, to have sympathy for the desires, for the fears, for the way they see the world. But not only that, but also to be able to communicate and to make explicit the way you understand the world, your desires, right? To build a relationship of empathy. It's really important here. And this doesn't mean that we have to agree with the worldview of the others, right? Understanding does not necessarily mean agreeing, but coming into a place of conversation, of exchange of ideas. So for example, in this research we are doing with a group of youth in Comuna 13, one of the sectors of Medellín, which is the sector here on this, depicted on this picture. We're doing this process of eliciting the narratives about human security. What does security mean for the inhabitants of this zone of the city? And some of the people, especially gang members, have said things like, to me, security means carrying a gun, a weapon with me. Understanding this is very important in spite of you not agreeing with this idea of security, given that understanding gives you an entry point into exchanging ideas and understanding further what are the implications of security in general. So this picture here, it's us here working with youth community leaders in another section of the city. And if you see there, we are seated in a circle. And this is very important specifically for the people that work in this section of the city, to function always as circles, right? So this is the result of us as outsiders recognizing these dynamics and being able to also adhere our work around these already in place dynamics. So why do we engage in relationships in the first place? Why is it that we engage in building rapport within our relationships? Well, relationships have different ends, right? We engage in relationships for companionship, to have fun, for love. But in this particular case, we engage in relationships to solve a shared problem. There is a problem that we need to resolve, to understand. So we engage in a relationship following, right, this end, this idea, which means that there has to be a structure, right? There is an end, there is an objective that you want to accomplish through these relationships. So then there is a structure. But in this particular circumstance, working with community leaders, the process is very messy. It's highly messy. And messy, not in a pejorative way, but another way of understanding it is that the process is very organic, right? You have this idea where you go from point A to point B, but within these 2 points, there are some things that take place, and then you have to take alternative routes into reaching this point B, right? So this is the messiness, the messy aspect of this process that has to do with, again, the environment, political changes, economical changes, changes on the dynamics of the conflict, the presence of different actors, right? NGOs that come into the area to also try to understand and solve these shared problems, etc. All of this makes the circumstances very messy. So the first principle then is to feel comfortable within this messiness, right? To not get distracted by these alternative routes, but to be focused and just feel comfortable with it. So here in our work, part of our work has been following this U theory approach, which consists on different iterations of doing fieldwork following these principles here. The first one is observing the environment, the people, sensing it, understanding, then retreating, right? Taking this distance to analyze, to reflect, and then going back into the system with some sort of prototypes and acting, right? Making things happen. So we have been following this, and I will go point by point on this U that you see on the screen as to how has it been specifically for us in Medellín. So the first part, as I said before, was really walking up and down these mountains, understanding the needs, the problematics that these youth face and that they try to resolve. And from there, we understood the importance of these historical networks, youth leadership networks. So working with youth from different sectors of the city, they, along with us, came up with the idea of building this platform that would serve as as a platform where all of the different groups of youth leadership in the city would have a space to converse, to co-create, and to look for shared needs to be tackled together, right? And they call this Puerta Abierta, which literally means open door. So this was still part of the observing and sensing part of our approach into Medellín. There were some lessons learned from this. We were able to comprehend the history of the city, the history of the struggle of the youth, the technologies that they have developed in their work, their methods, all of this. And we were also able to enter the network and start sharing some of the methods that we use and that we have produced and reproduced here at AC4, at the Earth Institute, which one is the Coordinated Management of Meaning, or CMM, which is this method that comes from the communicational perspective that allows you to elicit the stories, the personal and social stories that people tell about their social environment. And another tool that we shared with all of these youth during this time was the Dynamical Systems Theory, or DST, which is a way to understanding and mapping out systems and their complex relationships, right? So this was also a way for us to start not only understanding the system, but also the youth understanding our philosophical model, right? And then engaging in a process of sharing and starting to get into a shared understanding kind of. So the Puerta Abierta experience took place for a matter of a year or so. And then we engaged on reflection and wrote some articles about this experience, in which they were mostly reflective articles talking about the importance, for example, of art in all of the work that youth do in Medellín, the impact that art has not only in the aesthetic sense, but also in the political and economical sense, and also sharing some of the information that we started to elicit in our fieldwork with the academic world. We went to conferences together with some of the youth to make presentations about this experience, etc. Then, after this process of reflecting in art and writing, we went into working specifically with two groups from two different sectors of Medellín. One, it's Arte, or Art C8, Comuna 8. And it's this youth network from different perspectives trying to tackle a specific problem of insecurity in Comuna 8. So there were people working on human rights, on environment issues, on cultural and artistic expressions, on political leadership. And we worked with them, sharing, again, these methods, DST, CMM, and also supporting with a little bit of seed money for their projects and following up with them. And then with EPA, which means Popular School of Art in Comuna 8, Comuna 5 in Medellín, another sector, we engage more into the making of this school. So we took some time to work with two graffiti leaders, two graffiti artists, that are also community leaders in Comuna 5. And they had this idea of sharing their knowledge, their technical knowledge about graffiti making with not the youth only, but also with children. That showed, according to them, an interest for it, and also building on their own on their own experience with graffiti. So one of them mentioned that one of the reasons why he didn't engage with one of these armed groups that are in his neighborhood was precisely because he saw this group of graffiti artists when he was a teenager, and saw this as a way, as an alternative way to conduct his life rather than joining a gang, right, or a guerrilla or paramilitary group. All right, so they wanted to share this with the children. They saw this school as a very powerful way of creating alternatives for the children of this neighborhood. So then we, from the get-go, started to work with them, shared some tools in order for them to construct a theory of change. We also supported the process of making this like a legal judicial entity in the city, and also shared some of these methods that I have mentioned before, such as CMM and DST, in order for them to apply them in their work. Right, so this is a pre-prototype kind of part of our work, right? And then this led into this project that is called the Social Laboratories, right? And the whole idea with the Social Laboratory is that you construct a team, a lab of people that represent different sectors of the system that you're working in. So from Medellín, in this case, people from the government sector, people from the civic sector, like civil society, academia, private sector, entrepreneurs, public figures, etc. We all come together first to experience this U-theory process, right? Observe the setting, the city, sense it, comprehend it, and then create a shared understanding of the system. And from there, identify one specific issue to be tackled together, right? So we engage in this social laboratory. We constructed 2 of them, one a citywide laboratory, and then one situated in Comuna 5 in Medellín. And from there, we have also done different iterations of workshops. We have also used CMM and DST in this. And the Social Lab Medellín tries to tackle this specific issue, and it's how to resolve and how to create alternatives for the youth that are vulnerable of becoming actors in these structures of violence in the city, right? So how to set the conditions where youth find an alternative route to making a living different than joining these armed groups. That was the Social Lab Medellín question or issue to tackle. And then on the Social Lab Castilla in Comuna 5, the issue was around human security. So how to set in motion a project or projects that would construct human security for the inhabitants of Comuna 5, from children to the elderly, right? It was a general approach into human security. So as you can see, this has been a process between messiness, right? Dealing with different circumstances, but the end, the objective has always been clear, right? And this is a depiction, a cartoonish depiction, if you will, of this process. Right, so here are some principles. Trust the process. The process is as important as the end. As we said at the beginning, the relationship building is not the end. It doesn't become stable, but it's always in a state of flux, of reconstruction. So it's a process. Important in all of this is the engagement in listening. But listening doesn't only mean for you to to listen to what others, or hear what others have to say, but also be able to interpret through empathy what others have to say and provide feedback. So that new knowledge, new insights can arise, right? Can emerge rather from this listening aspect. So to not be as like a passive listener, but more of an active listener, right? So then there is this quasi formula here, which is to listen actively, then sharing, which is this your representations of those things that you have heard, then creating this shared understanding, right, of the situation, and then from there you co-create. And remember that all of this is part of the relationship building. In the process of doing social interventions or negotiation interventions in any setting, be it a corporation, governmental entity, or a neighborhood, the process of building the relationship is also the process of the intervention, right? So they run in tandem. So you have to take care of both. So we have engaged in this notion that comes from anthropology, especially American anthropology, called participant observation, which is that not only do you have to listen, not only do you have to do these walks, right, around Medellín, in this case, to understand the system, but you also have to participate in the intimate, everyday things of the people with whom you're building a relationship, which means that you have to engage in not only the meetings that take place for the sake of work, but also you have to engage in social meetings, sometimes understanding also the family relationships among them, right? So to not only observe, but also to participate in their everyday lives, as it were. And this is also another aspect of active listening, right? To not only listen, but to actively participate in all of this. Another important aspect here would be the respect, as it were, of time, right? Things take time. Just like problems have developed through time. So the violence, for example, in Colombia and in Medellín have developed through time. The responses, the solutions, the understandings of this also take place in time. So we should not look for immediate results. We should not look for immediate resolutions to these problems, but these things are incremental. They sometimes go back a little bit and then forward, right? So, and this all requires a lot of time. Then being present, which means literally showing up, not only working on a specific project for a specific amount of time and then leaving and not coming back. So with Beth, we have been very consistent in our presence in Medellín throughout time, via telephone, via in-person meetings, through the social media, etc. Then it's also important to take a distance. When you're when you're completely immersed in the system, there are things that you start to miss. You become a little blind, right? There are blind spots that are created when you're completely immersed in the system. So it's important to take some distance at some points, look at your notes, converse with your colleagues, read other perspectives from outside the system in order to then go back and give feedback, right? Make suggestions as to different ways of looking at the problem. And this is very well appreciated by the people that perhaps do not have the space to take the distance and leave, right, the system. So then at this point, you are already part of this network, right? You're taking with you all of this knowledge, all of these shared understandings, taking a distance, comparing it with what others have said about this specific issue, and then you're returning with feedback into this network, right? So the relationship at this point is established. You're already part of the network. But repeating again, these processes are not static, so you have to continue building the relationship, strengthen it, etc. So this leads us to the last part here, which is how do we assess that there is the existence of rapport in a relationship? And one way is to identify commitment in the relationship. So, of course, at the beginning, there is excitement for new people, outsiders, to come and work with you. But with time, these things fade out, right? The excitement fades out. There is not a lot of enthusiasm for this newness. But after almost 6 years of working with leaders in Medellín, this enthusiasm, this commitment remains. So for us, it's an indicator. This indicates, right, that there is some rapport in the relationship, that we have been able to build it, and that the relationship is transparent, authentic, right? Because for different projects, such as, for example, this book that Beth mentioned at the beginning, when we invited these co-authors to write with us, they were there, right? In spite of some of them already being working, some in school, etc. There is a commitment. Then another way to assess this, it's when you recognize that there are non-transactional dynamics in the relationship, right? That you don't feel the need to receive something from an interaction, nor to give something of any nature in the interaction, right? But the relationship just becomes a relationship in itself. It doesn't need some sort of external elements in order for it to continue, right? It's non-transactional. Then another indicator is the longevity of the relationship, right? One way to assess any type of relationship, it's if it's been able to resist time. And then that leads into us understanding that there is trust, right? You start to understand people's desires, people's problems. They also, of course, understand yours. And then this leads into a relationship of trust, where you not only speak about the business matters, but also engage in very personal and beautiful conversations. So this ends, I think, my presentation. One last thing to say is that relationships are transversal and not vertical. So this classic idea of building relationships top down or bottom up, it's not the best way of doing it, but they should be transversal in the making.
Great, thank you, Joan. So a couple of reflections to what you were saying, and two main ones. One is, it really depends on how you enter the system, how you are viewed, and how you can build trust. So in our situation, our colleague Aldo Civico had been there before and had already had relationships with some people. And through his introduction, we met some of the initial people in the city. And because he had a good reputation, then we already came in with an understanding that, well, we're friends of Aldo. And then we had to then substantiate ourselves and our relationship building as well. And when you think about not only top down or bottom up, it's some people introduce you to other people, and then you have to be mindful about who are you affiliated with, because, and we've learned in different ways that your reputation also is connected to who you are associated with. So if person A introduces you to a group of people and person A has a good reputation, then you already have a good opening. If person A, however, has had some difficulty or is not respected, or people have issues with that person, they may not say it to you directly because they may not want to badmouth the person, but they won't necessarily take to you because of how they view person A and how you are affiliated with that person. On other occasions, people are very quick to tell you what they think about different people. And then for me, I always ask myself, why is this person telling me that, right? What do they want me to do with that information? Are they trying to pull me over to their side and away from this person? Are they trying to warn me in good faith? So that's all part of the complexity of the relationship building. Let's see. Did you have a comment on that, Joan?
Yes, and indeed. So also, I guess Aldo was already part of this network, and it was he introduced us. He had some sort of reputation, and gave us access into this network that we of course had to follow up and continue building. So that's a very important point. The people you associate with.
Yeah. So I always say, it's always who you know. Who do you know? Who you're associated with? How are you entering a system? And then you can get into how do you build rapport in that system. So I'm going to check the Q&A box and see if we have questions. Okay, somebody here is, how do you measure the success of the intervention, for example, by using art? So I'm just going to give an initial reflection to this, and then Joan, please feel free to jump in.
Yes.
So when we were there in October, November, we were shown a big, tremendous mural that was done in front of a Museum of Memory in Medellín. And it wasn't just the mural itself, which was a mural done by a collection of different graffiti artists, I think maybe 5 or 6, and it was all represented reconciliation. But before they got to that, there is a foundation and a paint company called Pintuco, and they have a foundation. And part of what they do is they provide paint, but they do a social process before the graffiti artists take to the painting. And they have some information on that and about the healing process there. And this particular process involved leading community people through what does reconciliation mean to you? And then they came up with, in a very facilitated group process, different ideas about reconciliation. And after they went through that process, identifying all of that, then the graffiti artists came in and spoke with the community members, and then also then created those visuals. And one of the things that we've been called in, and we're going to be potentially working with the group, is thinking about how do you measure? And what are we measuring? So if we're measuring the community members, the people who contributed information for the mural, and what are we measuring? Are we measuring whether there was something cathartic about it, whether they have some new insights? So this is part of the monitoring evaluation that we've been working on and thinking about, because it is an important question. And not only the people who are part of the process, but then what about the other people in the broader community who were not necessarily part of the process, but who see the art? What effect does that art have on them? And that's just some of my initial reactions. Joan,
Yes.
did you want to add to that?
Yes. So to follow up, to build on what you were saying, so we did this photo essay exercise in one of the sectors there, a neighborhood in Castilla. And we did it was like a picnic kind of exercise where we were outside in this public gallery. That's how they call it, that it's a place full of graffitis. And one of the reflections about this photo essay exercise by one of the participants was that just the fact that we were able to be sitting there, having this conversation, doing this exercise during the day in this space, it indicates that there has been some process of transformation of this area that was used by mostly drug dealers, right? So it was a place, they call them plazas, which is a place where people go in and buy drugs, right? So this person said, just the fact that we are here indicates that art, in this case graffiti, it's able to transform, to make significant transformations, right? So that's one example, I think, of how you can measure the impact of art in transformations. And then the other one, it's Chifo's story, right? This graffiti artist that I mentioned at some point, that in his teen years was able to see this older graffiti artist in his neighborhood, and decided to join this group instead of the gangs around, right? So the way to measure these things are on the narratives, on the things people say about their experiences. They're hard to quantify, but you can engage in a process of evaluation, mostly at the level of narratives, right? On what people
So it's
say.
a qualitative narrative analysis that you're using to identify the transformation. And we've heard from many different people involved in a variety of arts, from music and dance to visual arts, about how they took a turn in their lives towards the arts. And if they had not taken that turn, they may have gone down the path of becoming part of the violence, because that what was present in their neighborhood. So we have another question here. How do you create awareness and subsequent demand for such a framework, especially in complex systems and societies? So also what Joan was saying is that we've been there almost 6 years, and we did not start larger scale initiatives until after the first 2 years. So during the first 2 years, we did small things, small initiatives in small ways, but we had to build relationships. So by building relationships and showing empathy and gaining understanding, our orientation was that we are foreigners in that neighborhood, and we don't really know their experience. We can learn about it. And I was, especially me being American, I mean, Joan is Colombian, but for me being American, I was also very conscious of not being a person coming in from a university from the US and saying, I know what you need and here it is, because I don't know what they need. And I have different things I could offer, but I don't know whether it's needed or how it will be received. So I had to constantly learn about who they are and what they're doing and build relationship, and then say, oh, well, here's something you might find useful, and then sort of share it with them, and then seeing what their response was. But it wasn't about me saying, this is the way with a capital T, because it's not. If they found it useful, I was happy to share more. And so when we started seeing what the responses were and how it was a way of them having an alternative way of explaining their stories and understanding their past and understanding their future, then we were able to build that initiative. But it took time, as Joan mentioned earlier. It's not a fast process. It does not happen overnight. It takes time to build relationship, establish rapport, and then you sort of have the invitation to share more.
Yes, and so I'm here rereading the question. So I think that part of the question is also on how is it that there is the creation of demand for the framework that we developed in other complex systems and societies. I think that's also part of the question. And the answer to that, it's really complicated. You have to decide where would you like to accomplish some sort of initiative in a complex system, and then the details, the nuances of that system will tell you how to guide the process, right? This is only a framework, and the details that I mentioned were specific to Medellín. But the framework itself, this theory, for example, can be taken other places, but being sensitive of the cultural and historical details.
Yeah, I was going to say also, even the two social labs that are running in Medellín are very different because the
Absolutely.
scope of who's involved in it is very different as well.
Yes.
And in terms of demand, sometimes we don't always know that we need something until we see a different way of doing something, and then we realize, oh, well, there is another alternative, and that things do not have to roll out or continue the way they have been. We can do something differently, but a lot of times, if we don't have that kind of exposure, then we don't know that there is an alternative way. So we don't even know that we have a demand for something else because we're not even in touch with a different way of doing things. So for example, in the graffiti artist example that Joan was mentioning earlier, when there are gangs around you and that's just a way of life, and you get to a certain age and you just naturally transition into it, maybe you're, small-time drug dealer doing like deliveries for people and so on, you think that's just the norm and that's just the way it is. And maybe if it's a really violent area, you don't expect to live past a certain age. There is a book called by Alonso Salazar, who is a former mayor of Medellín and a journalist. It's called Born to Die in Medellín, and he gives all different sorts of stories about people who this is just their existence. So they don't even know that there's an alternative way of being because the streets were so violent, and they just went into that. So when this particular graffiti artist, Shifwan, went to see something different, he went to a local library, and it just so happened it was at the time when his grandfather had died, and he was very close to his grandfather, and he saw the graffiti artist. So he was in a receptive state, so to speak. He was in a vulnerable and emotionally vulnerable state, and he was open to seeing something different, even if he wasn't conscious of it. And so when he saw the beautiful colors and shapes and the dynamism of what these graffiti artists were doing, it just resonated with him so strongly. He said, that's what I want to do. He also happens to be a tremendously talented artist. So being exposed to that possibility and already having the orientation and innate nature and ability to be able to do that all came together for him in that moment and totally took over his life and just directed him in a certain path in his life. And over the years, he's become more and more of an excellent artist in this kind of expression, and also giving back through the school EPA.
And this is what you just mentioned, Beth. It's also really, it's important also to understand this importance of the outside perspective, right? Indeed, it's important to immerse yourself in the system. The narratives told about the system from within are important, but then coming from outside necessarily means that you have a different outlook, a different perspective on the situation, which then creates alternatives, different ways of looking at the same issue. So in the case of Shifo, he found it for himself, but this is not the case in general, right? So this interaction between quote unquote outsiders and people in the system, it's really important because it creates some sort of like shocks, cultural shocks, or however you want to call them, that then open up ways to look at things from an alternative viewpoint and then act towards that.
Yeah, yeah. And so one of the things we've noticed also is that while people have their personal stories and their personal histories, there's also a lot that happens socially. And I would say that the majority of people we've worked with are very conscious of the collective. It's not just individual goals or individual transformations that they want. It's not necessarily that they only want what's good for them, but there's an open willingness to working with other people. And in fact, a desire, not just a willingness, but a desire to work with other people and to do things as a collective. And one example of that was in our most recent trip this in February, when we had a gathering of potential contributors to the book. It was so wonderful to see the dynamism, and that this particular group of people, even though we pulled them together from different places, have known each other and have been working on and off over the years with each other. So they also have a shared history. And so when you're also entering a system, you don't know all the histories of different people, but they had a very shared history, most of it good, not always positive, but most of it good. And there was an eagerness and a willingness and a mutual respect of wanting to work together to create one other iteration of the kind of work they've been doing, another representation in written form of some of the wonderful work they've been doing. And there's a mutual recognition across the people about the quality of the work each of them has done.
So to build on that and perhaps to end this webinar, so this book, right, talking about rapport, relationship building, the book represents, I think, for us, for the people with whom we work, this concrete, very tangible thing representing our relationship, right? This thing that we have built through time. And the book is divided in 11 chapters. Each chapter, it's an aspect of both the process of doing field work, but also the process of doing interventions or social transformations. And in each chapter, we are going, as Beth said, to write it with a co-author that is an expert, really, on the theme of the chapter. So one of the chapters, for example, tackles the first question that we received about the impact of art, right, as a way to transform societies, and then there's a person that is really the person that can speak about this from lived history. So this person will take charge of that, and like that, each chapter acknowledges that all of this knowledge, all of this information does not come from us, right? Coming from outside, from academia, but it's really this co-creation, this co-production of knowledge and of method and of technology into making transformations in societies.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we continue building the relationships, and it takes different turns, different iterations of how we work together. And then even after the book, there's a subsequent next turn, which is also going to be sharing that information and creating workshops that then teach people different methodologies. Now, it doesn't mean that they should do exactly what all of us have done, but it just means that it's another guide that they can then adapt to their own places. So this is something that will be open to anybody and have access. They'll have access to this information from anywhere in the world. And we are going to put it in Spanish for sure, and then maybe some other languages too. So I think we have no more questions. So I think that we could bring this to an end. Joan, do you have any other closing thoughts on this work?
Well, just the reiteration that relationship building, it's not an end, that it's a process, and that it's an ongoing process that has to be nourished.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. Well done. All right. So I think that's it for us right now. And I think Dom will have some closing remarks. Dom?
Yes, thank you so much, Beth, and thank you so much, Joan, for this really engaging conversation and presentation. I'll note to everyone that's attending, just as a reminder, we were recording today's session, so if there is any of this information that you'd like to re-review or go over, we'll have the recording of the session available to you via email. Joan, I'll ask if there's a better way to access some of this information, whether that's connecting with you or perhaps any resources that you have. What's the best way for them to find that information, if I could ask?
So our website, it's ac4.earth.columbia.com.
No, .edu.
.edu, sorry. So there in the Youth, Peace and Security section, there's a lot of information. There are some written reports and articles and some advances on the projects that we are doing in Medellín. So I think that's the best way of reaching to this.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing. And for anybody interested in learning some more information on the Master of Science in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program, please do feel free to reach out to us via the email communications that we'll send out with a link to the video. We'll have the email in that communication. It is negotiation@sps.columbia.edu, and I'd be happy to follow up with you with more information on the Master of Science program, the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program here at Columbia. So we'll go ahead and end this session today. Thanks again to our presenters, and thanks again to all of you who has attended today.
Thank you.
Thank you.